Challah. Today we are gathered together to discuss Challah. Yeah, it's a funny thing, you know, the nature of Jewish knowledge, you know, like typical Jewish knowledge, because, you know, everybody knows what challah is. You don't have to be Jewish to know what, you know, challah bread, as some of my friends call it. You don't have to be Jewish to know what challah is. And yet, on, you know, on another level, nobody knows what challah is. And that's we're soon going to see. Even, and I speak of, you know, including myself, even in preparing for this class, I'm like, oh, right, that's where it all comes from. So that's what we're going to do today, is try and figure out, where does it all come from? Not the recipe, but the very institution. Okay, let's say a blessing to sanctify our learning. Say a blessing over the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank God for giving us this this sacred conversation. Okay, so let's start with, I'd love to just hear, you know, challah is not a strange word in the Jewish lexicon. It's a familiar one. A lot of us have eaten challah. A lot of us has made challah. Would love to just start, you know, hearing from folks about their challah practices. Do you make challah? Do you ritualize the making of challah? How do you do that? Because there is a ritual, so I'm curious what people's different practices are. Does anyone have a challah practice they want to share with the group? Matt Silverstein.
About 3 months ago, I've been working towards making challah every Friday. I've been trying to make it we're coming into Shabbat, and I want to make a challah to celebrate that. I haven't got it as a full every single week, this is my practice, but I'm on that path.
Beautiful. And Matt, can I ask, and why are you on that path? Why are you trying to do that? Why does that feel meaningful to you?
Part of it is bread making is incredibly meaningful. Bread making is one of the most transformative things I can do, because I can take something that is utterly just yuck. I mean, flour is this dreadful thing. The notion of eating flour is worse than, and make it into bread, which is magnificent. So part of it is that it is transformation. That's
beautiful. That's beautiful. Let's hold that in our mind, and also just the kind of thinking that Matt is doing. What is our relationship to this basic human phenomenon? And I say human, meaning like it's a product of civilization to make bread, you know, to figure out like what it takes. We say hamotzi lechem min haaretz, we bless God who brings forth bread from the earth, but obviously it doesn't just pop up from the earth, right? We're blessing God on recognizing a whole process that it takes to get to us. And yeah, there's something about that process that as Matt describes it, is incredibly transformative. So there's something very basic about it and something very transformative about it. And so you can start to imagine why this might be a platform for some kind of value statement or spiritual performance. All right, let's just hear from someone else. Anyone else want to like have a challah practice that they want to share? Anyone just want to take us through what they do every week? Jen?
Sorry, I'm still trying to figure out the reactions tab.
Yeah, it's okay. You're high-fiving, you're clapping, you're doing it all.
I'm gonna get them all on here. I just this is so timely because yesterday I finally got gluten-free challah, like edible, after like 8 tries. So my spiritual practice so far has just been keeping the faith that I could do it. But what I thought was really interesting was the research I had to do on what to make it count, how to make it count as bread, like how to make it actually be challah, because you could just do it with like rice flour. And so like I had to add oat flour in order to like get it to count. I think it was oat flour. So it was really interesting. And yeah, just the practice of doing it, just like creating a thing and believing that I could take all of these like loose ingredients and turn it into something and then sharing it and having it be eaten and enjoyed by other people definitely felt like a spiritual practice to me.
Ooh, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. And I got especially delighted when you're describing the nerdy Jewish law part of me is like, oh, that's right. And that you have to have certain kinds of flour, and what kinds of flour, what counts as challah. And that's part of, we will get some of the basic information. That's part of where we're headed as we head into the Mishnah here. And the Mishnah is the place where the details, the practice of the law gets kind of worked out, right? We in this class we're moving through the Mishnah, and that's why we're talking about Challah today, because we've now arrived at a tractate of the Mishnah, a volume of the Mishnah called Challah. If you looked at it, you would think that it's about bread baking, right? But it's not exactly. It is the source of the word challah, so they're connected. But as we'll see, it's a kind of a twisted connection. It's not a straightforward connection. So we're going to kind of get to know what was the original challah, what was that, and how did we get to where we are? Okay, and actually, to really go all the way back, we have to go back before the Mishnah, because the Mishnah is discussing a law in the Torah. And this is what I mean when I say to myself, as much as, to any of you, that we know things and we don't know things. Like, everybody knows what challah is. Who knows the challah in the Torah? I mean, some of you do, but I just I don't even think about it. It's not something I spend a lot of time on, but this is the challah in the Torah. So let me give you first the source sheet as a chat. We're going to just look at it, try to understand what's the basic idea of challah in the Torah. Here's a source sheet for you all. Did that go through? Yeah. And then we'll get into the Mishnah and sort of see how the rabbis imagined that this was practiced. And by the end of our session, I hope, we'll have a sense of how we're going to have to fast forward, centuries at a certain point to kind of compress a bunch of history into these loaves that we put on the table on Friday night, right? And I guess I should say that there's a whole ritual process, even with it's not just making the challah, there's a blessing, maybe some of you have said, over the challah, and there's a custom that we're soon going to get to. I just want to put this out there so we know, we're part of what we have to figure out is this idea of taking, anyone ever taken a piece and put it in the oven? Right? Yeah, I'm seeing some nodding heads. So that's also part of it, and that's also the the lesser known part, especially to people like me who buy their challah, right? So it's it was already done. All right, but that's already getting ahead of ourselves. Let's take a look just at the source in the Torah, and it's called challah, but the word challah here, we're gonna have to, it's not clear exactly how to translate it, and so I haven't translated, I'm just calling it challah, but you'll see that it seems to be used in slightly different ways in slightly different places, okay? But it's in the book of Numbers. In the book of Numbers, in the section where they're detailing all of the sacrifices that the priests will make on the various holidays, and then they just start talking about the priestly institution, the offerings. Okay, so here we go. The Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, "Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, daber el bnei Yisrael v'amarta lehem b'voachem el haaretz asher ani mevi etchem shama." Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land to which I am taking you, v'haya ba'achalchem milechem haaretz tarimu truma ladonai, and you eat of the bread of the land, you shall set aside a gift to the Eternal. The word gift we might also translate as donation, and it's a word we've seen before in our studies, truma, the donation, the truma. Now, if you have been with us, you know that truma is also the word that we use just for the donation that one is obligated to give to the priests is truma. But that just means donation, and they're using that word here also to describe a donation of bread. What kind of donation? Well, here's the language for it. I don't know that it's entirely clear. Reshit arisotechem chala tarimu truma, ki trumat goren ken tarimu ota. Okay. From the first kneading of dough, you shall give a challah as a gift. So you could translate this as loaf. You could translate it, it's just an amount, like the challah amount. You could say a little piece of cake. There's lots of ways to translate challah. We'll sort of see it moving through the various texts. But from your dough, you give a challah. And you set it aside the way you do your produce, where like after on the threshing floor, you separate truma. This truma donation to the priests, just like you do with produce, you do with dough. Okay, mirishit arisotechem titnu ladonai truma ladorotechem. You shall make a gift to the Eternal from the kneading of dough throughout the ages. Okay, so what's going on here? What is this? What are we being asked to do? Let's just start there, and then of course, and why? But I'll take an answer to either question. What's happening and why? Take a look at that text more and give me some answers. Ken, do I see you braving the? Yeah, please jump in, Ken.
Well, it's like the firstborn or the first fruits. We're setting the first aside for God as a way of remembering, magnifying, representing the human connection.
Good, very, very nice, Ken. Ken almost takes it like, jumps a level and gives us symbolic or linguistic analysis even, because the word here, reshit, is pretty significant, and we've seen it come up before. Reshit, it was here twice. Now, we know the word reshit because it's in a sense the first word in the Torah, bereshit, in the beginning, right? It's a compound of that. But also reshit is a word that comes up again and again with the donations to God. The first of your flock, the first of your fruit, maybe the first of your firstborn, right? I think we discussed that in our last Parsha class. So there's this theme of, you take the first part, whenever you have something, you take the first part of it and you donate it to God. Why? Why? How about why?
Well, the why would be so you don't forget that whatever you have is not by your hand alone. It's a gift. It's the result of your connection to the holy.
Great. That seems pretty straightforward. I'm open to other kinds of interpretations. What Ken gives us, I think, hard to argue at the basic understanding is this is a tribute to God. Look at what I have. Thank you, God. Here's the first part of it for you as a way of acknowledging you are the source of my abundance. I rely on you. I trust in you. I pay tribute to you. Okay, that's it. That's the point of challah. So the idea is you're kneading dough and you take a piece, or you take a loaf of it. You take the first part of your dough. I'm not sure exactly what's the first part, but the first knead, at the first time that you're kneading the dough into bread, you take some and you give it to, how do you give it to God?
You make it separate.
Yeah, that's right. You take it away, you separate it. But who do you give it to? Who do you give it to? Irene?
There we go. Well, you're giving it to the priests, and anthropologically and historically in our species, as we got classes, the priests produced nothing whatsoever. Their whole job was to intercede with the divine for us, because we're busy as merchants and warriors and farmers, et cetera, et cetera. So the only thing they ever got to eat is what we gave them. So we would offer it to God through them. God got the smoke. If something was burned, they would eat the meat. But But my question is now, we do it with this dough that we burn, but that would not have fed the priest. So you said earlier that this isn't necessarily a lump of raw dough. It could actually be a loaf or be, I don't know, the grain to make a loaf. What?
Okay, great.
Because raw dough would not feed anybody.
Let me try and answer that. But you're really giving us most of the answers already, which is to say, Irene is exactly right. The way that you give a donation to God, so the idea here is you're giving it to God. It belongs to God. But the way that you give it to God in this system of offerings and such things is to give it to the priests. And in fact, that's how the challah would be used. It would not be burnt up. It would be used by the priests, right? For them to eat, right? So the priests would take the challah, and it was still in dough form. You would take it, and every Shabbat they would collect dough and bring it together, because now Irene is in some ways already critiquing the priestly class as she describes the way that the priests, let's just start neutral. They work in the temple. They don't have the whole idea of the tithes, the priests benefiting from the tithes. They work in the temple. They are intermediaries to God. They don't have time to grow and cultivate their own food. So we support the priests with a tithe from or a donation, actually, from our own produce, right? But Irene says, yeah, and then what happens when the priests become reliant on this, or self-interested, or corrupt, or all of these things? By the time the rabbis are writing this, they're well aware that the priestly class has become totally degenerate. And after all, at a certain point, the temple is destroyed. But even before then, one has a sense that the priests are living off of the people, right? So I put that out there, but I also want to table it for now, because good that we are aware of that, but at first we still need to do work just to understand the idea or the ideal of the challah system. Okay, so that's the source. That's the Torah itself suggests that from dough we give to God. We give to God as a way of, I think I'm sticking with Ken's interpretation of just acknowledging that I'm grateful to God for my produce. God is the source of my abundance. And I do that by giving to the priests and supporting the priestly class, because after all, they also are the ones that make offerings to God. So it supports the system of making offering to God. That's a generous or neutral understanding of the institution. But how does it work? Now let's dive into the Mishnah, which is going to tell us the when and the how and we begin with this question that Jen raised for us earlier, which is the question of what actually requires challah. When you're making challah, I don't know how to answer this question, because it's the category, the legal category itself is the question. The legal category is the grains that require the separation of challah. But what we're really talking about is basically what is bread, right? The Torah asks us to separate from bread. What is bread? Let's just ask a really, and this is a lot of what rabbinic literature is about. It's just a kind of ontological question. What is bread? What constitutes bread? What is that thing which humans, how do we define bread? Right? That's part of the journey here. So let's take a look at what they say. And as Jen was already helping us see, there are certain flowers that are considered worthy of challah, or subject to challah, or obligated in challah. So this is the first Mishnah in challah. Chamisha dvarim chayavim b'challah. There are 5 species that are subject to challah. These are wheat, barley, spelt, oat, and rye. Hachitim, v'hasorim, v'hakusmin, v'shibolet shu'al, v'shipon. Okay, those are the 5 species that are subject to challah. these are all subject to challah, and they can be combined with one another. You could have a loaf that was made, and Jen was actually doing some of this combining, like a loaf that's made up of various kinds of flour, but as long as it has some of this flour in it, this is what constitutes challah. Okay. When I say constitutes, I mean this, using these grains is when you are, I'm not saying this very eloquently, when you use this flour to make bread, then you have to take challah. So presumably only this flour, and the question is why? Why? So here's the classical commentator on the Mishnah, Rav Ovadia mi Bartanura, the Bartanura. Just like Rashi is the classic commentator on the Talmud, the Bartanura is probably the most classic commentator on the Mishnah. And what he says here is, if I asked him the question, wait, why those 5 grains? He says we learn about challah, like which grains constitute the challah bread, from the laws of Passover. For in Passover, the matzah is called the bread of affliction. And challah also speaks about bread, and you eat of the bread of the land. Okay, rather than just continuing to drag us into the text, let's just clarify what's happened here. That some of you may even know this from Passover as well. Matzah also can only be made of those 5 grains, and more importantly, when those 5 grains leaven, when those 5 grains ferment and rise, that's considered chametz. That's the bread you don't eat on Passover. So it's a big question, what is bread? Because you are forbidden from eating bread on Passover. It's a very serious prohibition, actually. So they have to figure out, well, how do you make sure not to eat bread? Well, bread is those 5, and they spend a lot of time defining what bread is over in the laws of Passover. And then the Mishnah here, suggests the commentator, is linking these 2 sets of laws. Anytime now you see bread, you know it's these 5 grains. Okay, that's all very technical. Bread here, bread there, what we can learn about bread here, we can learn about bread there. But there's something much deeper happening, which is there's a link being made between Passover and matzah, and the bread of matzah, and then challah and the bread of challah. If nothing else, we see that our religion has 2 huge bread practices, right? Like if on a very, like the Mibar Nur is suggesting that they're more intricately woven together. They like the laws inform one another, but it is at least enough for us to think, oh, so we're always thinking about our bread. You know, like bread is the symbol that we use on Passover for what? And maybe I should just pause and say, what is the bread on Passover for? I mean, maybe this is like an obvious question, but let's speak it out. What does the matzah of Passover do for us? Why do we eat matzah on Passover? Payam, I'm going to come back to you because I feel like this isn't the question you want to address. Rosa, you raised your hand to this question.
Yeah, it's the bread of affliction.
Good. And so?
Well, so it signifies that it's not something that is pleasurable to eat, which matzah is not. So it signifies our departure from Egypt. It signifies our time in Egypt and all of that. Whereas challah, on the other hand, is something that we bake for Friday night. It's something we enjoy.
Good. Okay. So they're very different in some ways, right? Matzah is like lechem oni, the bread of affliction. Challah, the whole point is that it's baked into, it's a whole different thing. It's like this luscious bread, the bread of offering, the bread of bread. But Rosa's right. The reason that we eat matzah on Passover is to remember, ki biyad chazakah hotzi Hashem, because God took us with a mighty hand out of Egypt. But for that, we wouldn't even be here. That's what matzah's for. Then we get there and we make real bread. And then we take challah. Why do we take challah? To remember that God is the source of this abundance. So maybe I'm saying an obvious thing, like there's a lot of God in this religion, but think about the way that bread becomes a medium for bread becomes a medium for one's spiritual life. I was like hinting at this at the outset, but bread is the substance upon which you communicate something or remember something or have a relationship to God through bread, right? So let's just think about that for a minute. I'm sure I can turn to Payam for some philosophical thoughts on the matter.
I'm just confused about something. In the beginning part, isn't challah a special subset of bread itself? It's not like bread equals challah. Challah is a special kind of bread. Isn't that correct?
Well, it's a portion of the bread. I think the best way to translate challah in the opening verses is that you take a little loaf out of the bread. You have dough, but you remove a loaf's worth, a challah.
Of all bread? It doesn't matter what kind of bread it is?
Well, we just said, well, it has to be one of these 5 grains. Anything else?
Well, then if it's one of these 5 grains and you're going into Pesach, all bread is chametz on Pesach, isn't it?
Well, no. Okay, so let's take a look at that for a second. And I understand we're a little in the weeds, but this stuff is, I think, important anyway, because it is like, part of, we encounter this question, what constitutes bread, on Pesach, right? On Passover every year. And in that context, it becomes a real kind of logistical question. Like, how can we figure out what bread is? And, as you know, it leads to major divides in communities, right? Like the Sephardic community, they eat rice on Passover. That's a huge difference in practice. Like, is rice bread? You can make rice bread, but is right? Okay, so who's right, Ashkenazi or Sephardi? Well, Sephardi is the answer. Basically, take a look at the Mishna here. Okay, so they're just speaking out the rest of this question. If these 5 grains are the ones that constitute bread, then here are all of the things that do not require challah. The following are liable for tithes. In other words, you give part of this like any other produce, but exempt from challah. This isn't bread. Rice, millet, poppy seed, sesame seed, and look, here's the word, kitniot. Little like grainy things that are not of the 5 grains, but all of these, the kitniot is the word that we use to describe all of the like bread-like things that it is in Ashkenazi custom not to eat during Passover. It makes Passover very untasty. It's not our favorite part of our Ashkenazi heritage, a lot of us, right? But that's the way it is. At least at the moment, that's the way it is. There's a major divide because these are all things that do not count as bread, and those who do not eat them on Passover have taken on extra strictures. Okay. And then anything that less than 5/4 of a kav of grain, and sponge cakes and honey cakes and dumplings, a cake cooked in a pan, otherwise known as a pancake, and meduma are exempt from challah. Sorry. All right. So I don't know. I could go through that list, but I think it'll take us too much time. Why this? Why this? Why this? Why this? But you can see them saying like, look, there are 5 grains that if you use them, we'll call that bread. And you have to, then you're in the realm of ritual and in the realm of communicating a message to God and in the realm of matzah and challah and all these things. And then there's like all this other stuff that is grainy, but that doesn't count. That's not challah. Okay, you don't have to worry about the mitzvah of challah for those things. Okay, so part of what the Mishnah is doing here is giving us a break. Like the Mishnah is limiting for us the obligation. It's not like every single time we make a cake, we have to give challah. No, the Mishnah is saying it's specifically with the act of making bread. And I think I think it's worth asking why. I mean, we've been answering it all along, and maybe there's nothing more to say than just making bread is a deep and, It's like it's the staff of life. But the Mishnah is going to keep going and giving us more limitations. When do you have to make challah? When do you have to take challah? When do you not? And we're going to sort of like clip through them. But the last one is the one that I really want to focus on. So there are limitations on the size of challah. So 5/4 of a kav of flour are subject to challah. And then the minimum measure of challah is 1/24th part of the dough. And then they say if a baker makes to sell in the market, and so too if a woman makes to sell in the market, it is 1/48th. A woman, because presumably the baker would be some professional in the marketplace and the woman would be someone selling it out of her house. But okay, now we've got some of the laws of like, well, how you need actually quite a bit of flour in order to make challah. So not only with these 5 grains, but also, this is the detail section of the class, okay? If you need to go get a drink or like, run to the restroom, this is the detail section of the class. So 5 grains are the only ones you make challah with. And you also need a significant amount of flour to make challah, right? So much so that you actually are not, like, you don't make the blessing over a challah unless you have made a real abundance. What's the practice? 5 pounds, 10 pounds of challah? Anyone know? Yeah, Sophia.
I think it's like basically the bag of flour, like a 5-pound bag of flour.
5-pound bag of
flour. A little less than a bag of flour, which is like 5 challahs, depending.
Okay. Yeah. So you don't not just every time you're baking. And this is part of the reason why it comes up on Shabbat, because not that many times you're making a lot of challah, but that's 5 pounds. That's a lot of challah. That's not you just making challah for your family, right? Okay, so you need to be making that much. You give a 24th, which is significant, or if you're selling it, a 48th, which is maybe a lot less significant, like it's not a ton that you have to give, but it's a distinct percentage. Okay. And then finally, this is the last sort of qualification. So only those 5 grains, only if you're making a massive amount, only a 24th part. And then finally, tell me what's there's one last variable that they start playing with here. And you kind of have to read between not too hard between the lines, but they don't say it explicitly. They say it as a sort of assumption. Take a look at the next Mishnah here. Produce from outside of the land of Israel that came into the land of Israel is subject to challah. If it went out from here to there, Rabbi Eliezer renders it liable, but Rabbi Akiva makes it exempt. So what's the rule? What are they talking about? What variable now are they considering? I'm just going to put it back on screen.
Who's eating it?
Who's eating it?
Where it was grown.
Good. There's a where question. And actually, it turns out it's not only where it was grown, but actually where it was grown and where it's being made into dough. So take a look here. Produce from outside of the land of Israel that came into the land. It wasn't grown in Israel, but it's brought into Israel. Then you make, when you make dough, you separate challah. But if it is from the land of Israel and goes out, there's a debate. Okay? In other words, challah has to happen on all grain in the land of Israel. When you're making bread in Israel, you separate challah. When you're making bread outside of Israel, first of all, if the produce isn't from Israel, there's no question. Yeah, we have a little bit of a question of like, what if you brought grain from Israel out? Would challah still apply? But here's the real point. The real point is that challah is basically an in-Israel mitzvah. And here, you've suffered through a lot of details, but here I arrive at I think, a very important and difficult point to consider, which is that we have been studying agricultural law for like weeks and weeks and weeks now in the Mishnah. But for the most part, this whole body of law doesn't apply to us. doesn't apply to us. We don't need to do challah. We don't need to do truma. We don't need to do, right? There are, this whole body of law that we've been studying is laws that apply, Shemitah, the sabbatical year, all of these important Jewish institutions, these important Torah institutions, they actually don't apply outside of the land of Israel. So that's what that I think is something that we really need to process. Like, we really need to think about, what do you do with an entire legal system that doesn't apply to you, especially if the legal system is a sacred legal system? Like, what do we do with the fact that challah is, we don't have to ever separate challah, right? And we don't have to do any of the agricultural laws. Is that a good thing, or is that a bad thing? I mean, I don't, like, it's certainly a significant thing, isn't it? I mean, I'd love to take some thoughts on that, on the entire body of Jewish law that has no application to us now, none whatsoever. Yael.
I'm thinking of Shemitah, especially. It's jumping out at me, but also the challah part. If we're talking about ethical equity and talking about having a community that is based on ethics and justice, then how can we not do that? And even the challah part, it's a ritual that, like you were talking about, we're recognizing that God, and others were talking about, we're recognizing that God gives us our sustenance. This isn't all from me. I didn't raise this chita, this grain, and make it into bread, and it's all on me. It's a gift. So if we don't do it, I think we would be worse off.
Okay, good. Thank you for sharpening the problem for us, Yael. That is, all of these laws have meaning, purpose. They communicate deep ethical values. You mentioned Shemitah, where the idea of Shemitah is that you let the land lie fallow because it belongs to God. Isn't that true outside of Israel? Or you let the poor come and collect the corner of the field, because you should always be aware when you grow things that the poor need to be fed as well. Isn't that true outside of the land of Israel? When you make bread, you take a little piece off and you say, for God, for God. That's suddenly not true outside of the land of Israel, right? Like, this is a problem. This is like a strange move. Now, why is this the case? Why is this the case? Well, the answer is rather technical, because our very first source said that this happens when you come into the land which I'm taking you. So it's just like, this is stuff that happens in the land. The Torah did not want the Israelites in the desert to be, worried about farming. They thought, this is for you when you get into the land. The Torah envisions that. So what do we do with all of these beautiful ethical ways of relating to our earth and the produce of our earth if it just doesn't apply outside the land of Israel? We just lost all that stuff, right? Okay, let's see. Thoughts on this great loss, Matt Silverstein?
When you first asked the question, I was going to put on a different hat, my very, very religious Jewish hat, and say, oh, well, you're denying me a mitzvah. So I'm going to keep that hat sort of close and say, well, what do I do with this? Well, I'm going to follow the mitzvot anyway, even if I don't have to, because it's still an opportunity to do right. It's still an opportunity to be ethical and to give, to God and all that. So I'll just ignore that point.
Good.
That's
okay.
my reaction.
Good. Okay. So one position, really, I hope you notice we've sort of stumbled, through all these details and all, we sort of stumbled into a major question, a major religious tradition question. What do you do when the law no longer applies? Do you keep it or not? And Matt says, wait, I'm not, this belongs to, this is part of my sacred tradition. One approach is we got to find a way to apply it. I'm keeping this. How long have we been in exile? Right? I mean, like what, we're going to lose like 1/6 of the Mishnah. We're going to lose like all these laws in the Torah. So one position is, no, we're going to figure out how to apply it here and now. Anybody want to offer a different approach or position on this? Paim, are you able to speak to this? I can't tell.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to disagree, but I think what's interesting is this is a question of prosperity, in the sense that when they were out in the diaspora after in the Babylonian exile, they're not in the position of the prosperity they were when they had a kingdom. So in that sense, I think it's like a safeguard of like, okay, well, they're in, you know, and they're like slaves in Egypt, example. But then the question of today then is, are we in a position of prosperity? Like if you look at Jews in America, I mean, we're probably more prosperous than they were in that. So in that sense, if you view it as prosperity, then probably it does apply to us.
Okay, this is beautiful. What Matt and Paim have done is set up for us a kind of a tension in approaching the question of what do you do with law that no longer applies. And on one end of that tension, you might say, Matt says, we're going to figure out a way to make it apply. But there's another end of that tension, another way of thinking about this, which is that it's not a loss, it's a burden to have to figure out how to like import a part of the religion that is not relevant anymore. And actually what we should do is we should leave the things in the past, or we should leave the things in Israel. So those two approaches actually are articulated for us in the Mishnah itself. So take a look, for example, at the next text here that describes people coming in and trying to give challah from other places. So Nitai of Tekoa, he himself was from the land of Israel, but he brought chalot from Beitur. Now, the actual Hebrew here is a little tricky. It looks like a place in Israel, but they assume that it's not in Israel. I don't want to get into that right now, but they didn't accept it from him. The assumption is it came from outside of Israel. Here's a clearer example. The people of Alexandria brought their challah from Alexandria, but they didn't accept them. Right? And then there are all these other examples of people bringing these mitzvot, trying to keep these mitzvot from outside the land of Israel. People from Mount Seboim brought bikurim prior to Shavuot, but they did not accept from them. Ben Antinos brought up Bechorot from Babylon, but they did not accept it from him. And on, all these things, they wouldn't accept it if it was from outside the land of Israel. But the point is, why? So that the thing should not become firmly fixed as an obligation. In other words, there were people, once the exile had begun, who would travel to Israel and say, no, I still want to make challah. Look, I made challah I'm still donating. I'm still participating in all these agricultural mitzvot. There's a little record of that. People visiting, traveling to the land of Israel to show that they still want to keep up these ancient traditions. And what do they do in Israel? They turn them away. They turn them away, which sounds very horrible, sad, offensive, disrespectful. But they turn them away because they don't want to get into the business of the entire diaspora feeling that they have an obligation to fulfill the agricultural laws. So that's one position, right? And, you know, again, I throw it to you for your consideration. What's the value principle in that decision to say, hey, it's too much to expect. It shouldn't be an obligation. These things that belonged in the land of Israel, leave them in the land of Israel. We cannot insist on them throughout history. I think I saw Agnes had a hand up. Do you want to?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking that there's this way in which this is, if you're not in Israel, that this is a form of practice, the way that we talk about Shabbat as being practiced for the world to come, that you have to sort of get into your body and into your consciousness certain relationships to rest and certain relationships.
You're unmuted. I just muted you. Sorry about that, Agnes.
So I wonder if there's something about saying we're not accepting these things from outside the land of Israel, that is about also a bit saying that it's not about a literal obligation that you have to this geographic place. We're sort of like in our lives, wherever we are, whether in Pasadena or in Syria, we're sort of spiritually oriented towards a moment when we will be in Israel, whether physically or spiritually. And our activities are practices that shape our realities here and now in our realities, as opposed to, you know, like FedExing something to Jerusalem and having this literal relationship to this other place that you see as separate from you. It's a place that is inside of you and that is a horizon in the future in some way.
I love that. I love that. A beautiful, beautiful interpretation there. And not just interpretation, but sort of theory of what we're dealing with here is like a theory of ancient Jewish, of Torah law as it plays out in the diaspora. Like, should you be trying to like enact all of these things, keep them up? Or as Agnes suggests, is it maybe that you actually don't have these things because you maintain the ideals and the yearning, but part of the ideal. So first of all, question is like, how do I manage my spiritual life in the diaspora? Do I kind of send donations to the Holy Land? Or do I like get in touch with the deeper principle? And, suggests Agnes, there's also the part of that deeper principle is one day we'll be back in the land of Israel. And that matters, and we will yearn for that. But right now we're not. We've been exiled, and part of what we are doing here in the exile is to dream about the Holy Land. So we actually do have a kind of we consecrate the separation. And this is a well-established Jewish theological position, that a lot of the mitzvot are to be held in abeyance until the Messiah comes. Meaning, in other words, until some kind of return, until some kind of redemption. But right now, these things are on hold, and that's part of the spiritual experience. Okay? I'm not attributing everything I just said to Agnes, but she sort of took us, you know, some of the way in that direction. I think it's important to think about that. To think about that possibility. Okay. More thoughts, Ken.
It occurs to me that there's a problem in the text, because at the end of verse 11, it says that Ariston brought his first fruits, and they accepted them from him, for they said, "He that owns land in Syria is as one that owns land in the outskirts of Jerusalem." So you can see here there's some kind of differentiation between not entirely within the borders of Israel, but close enough. So that's one point that we can all see maybe a little bit of fudging for some reason. But the other point I want to make is it seems to me that the reason that they give for not imposing this is the fear of burdening an obligation on the diaspora. But what if it is not a burden? What if it is something that's voluntarily done for reasons of community, broadly speaking, and for reasons of self-identity? It seems to me.
Okay. May I jump right in, because you're setting us up perfectly, Ken, as is often the case, because we have just been really processing what it means to say, hey, let's not get carried away. You don't have to do it if you're in far-flung lands. These laws, we'll suspend them for right now. That's not the point. Is not to be like mailing it, whatever. It shouldn't be a burden to us. That's one approach. But the other approach is like, no, we want to do it. We want to keep, I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose all relationship to these basic laws of the Torah. I still eat matzah, don't I? Right? Okay, and that approach, and here finally, towards the end of our hour, we start to see it's this moment where the ancient practice of challah begins to turn into our contemporary practice of challah. And it all comes from one brief line in the Talmud, and they're in the middle of a long discussion thinking about exactly this question. What about the agricultural laws? Do they apply outside the land of Israel or not? And they're moving through various agricultural laws, trying to figure out whether they apply. and they get to challah, and they start off by discussing, well, do you have to be pure to offer challah? And various states of purity and impurity. It's a little too much to drag us through right now. But ultimately, they suggest, well, here's what you can do if you're outside the land of Israel. They suggest a new practice. Okay, and this I think is a pivotal moment and the beginning of our contemporary challah practice. So a woman may separate challah. There's a lot of presumptions of like the gendered nature of this mitzvah, but we can talk about that another time. A woman may separate challah outside of Israel, and a child priest may eat it. There's like questions about purity there, and the child has still maintained purity, again, for another time. But if there's no child priest available, she takes the challah with the top of the skewer, a masa, and throws it in the oven, and then separates another piece of challah, so that the Torah of challah should not be forgotten. Okay, this is the phrase that presents us with the other end of that tension, right? Delo tishkachech Torat challah, so that the Torah, and the Torah there means like the teaching of challah, but also it's also the word, this part of the Torah. So what do they suggest? They say, well, you can't really, there's no priest around, you can't really give the challah. You're not really obligated to give the challah. Let's be honest. We already basically are getting the feeling you don't have to give challah. But you know what you can do? You can rip a piece off, put it on a skewer, stick it into the oven, burn it, and call it a day. Call it challah, in other words. So like, on the one hand, that seems like, wait, what? That's the mitzvah now? You like burn a little lump in the oven? That's not the mitzvah. It has nothing to do with the mitzvah. Nobody gets that. Was it like doesn't support the priesthood? There is no we're not in the land of it. We don't have to do this at all. But no, the rabbis say, do this version of it so that you don't forget about what challah is. That's a big move, right? That's a big move that the rabbis are making. That's a whole new legislative mechanism. You know what? Here's a new version of the mitzvah. Just do this instead, even though you don't have to, because we want you to remember the mitzvot. Okay, I don't have a question. What do you think of that? I go, why are the rabbis doing that? Well, what are they trying to accomplish? What is their religious agenda or vision here? Okay, that's my question. Let's see, Dina.
I guess the piece I've been thinking about is that by forbidding the practice in the diaspora, you are anchoring the Jewish people in the land of Israel and encouraging the yearning for the return to Israel. So that it's a privilege. There's only certain things that you get to do if you're living in Israel, and therefore it's continuing to connect the diaspora to Israel.
That's right. That's right. And that you will hear exactly that sort of I would say like rhetoric is alive in some of the debates around these laws today, because there is an active Jewish community in the land of Israel. A lot of the sort of more Zionist among the sort of Jewish religious community argue that no, that's the point, is like we are now able to do those things. They are meant for the land of Israel. We're supposed to have a special relationship to the land of Israel. And so that's why these mitzvot are waiting for us. And Agnes was describing this a little bit too. There's some idea that we have a vision of returning to the land, and we're supposed to feel connected to that return to the land itself. That's what all these mitzvot are for. And so you should be cut off from them when you're outside of the land of Israel, right? That's part of the, people will say this about keeping 1 day or 2 days of Yom Tov, of holiday observance. Like, no, you have to keep 2 days because you don't get to keep 1 day unless you're here and you're supposed to be in the land of Israel. That's one way of, of thinking about this, is there's a sanctity to the land. And then of course, on the other hand, right, like people arguing, no, it's not, like our religion's beyond the land. Our religion's spiritual. Our religion's inside of us. Right? We can, halacha, the whole idea of Jewish law is that it can be practiced anywhere. Isn't that what the rabbis did after all? Didn't they figure out a legal system that was meant to be carried out in the exile? Isn't this a religion, the rabbinic religion, of departing from the land of Israel and the temple and da da da? So you can see the tension here. Okay. Let's see. Did anyone I didn't get yet? I think I saw David Yaroslavsky had his hand up. Do you want to jump in here, or no?
I didn't think I did. Sorry.
Okay, no worries, no worries. Let's turn to Yael and then Jen. Not Yael, then Jen. Great. Jen, were you back? Jen, Bailey, Gara? Oh, we can hear you. That's what it is.
That whole unmute thing.
Yes.
So much of ritual practice is about, you could use different words for it, but collapsing space and time or connecting space and time, and the idea that spiritually, I don't even want to say transcending space and time, but we can hold space and time together in a moment so that we can be Israel or be in Israel spiritually, or we can be with, you know, the people at Mount Sinai spiritually, or the people who are entering the land of Egypt spiritually. Like, it seems consistent to be doing this outside of that as a way of continuing that practice. That seems like a theme in a lot of our practices.
Yeah. Right? Is that part of what we do as a people? Is we reenact something? Don't we do that on Passover? We reenact that story. Don't we also reenact the times in the land of Israel? And if you're like wondering, like, well, do we really do? Think about all of the way all of our prayers are structured in a way that echoes the earlier offerings. A lot of our religion is actually kind of built on ancient structures. Aren't we supposed to be doing that, to sort of like creating a spiritual architecture that reminds us of the past? That's certainly one approach. All right, let's take one last comment from Rosa.
Okay, so what I was thinking is, aside from the imbuing us with the memory of what it was or what it will be when we're back in the land of Israel, the rabbis of the Talmud very often use laws from the land or from other things to extrapolate new laws. So is this just is this setting us up for a future law?
Oh, Rosa, you are so beautiful. Thank you. Because you just set us up. You set us up perfectly, because that is exactly what happens. And we just have 2 more minutes here, but I want to you saw the major move here, right? Where in the Talmud, the rabbis say, well, there's not really like a challah obligation here, and you can't really give it to a priest, but you know what? Take some out and just burn it in the oven. We'll call it challah. And I don't just mean we'll call it challah, we'll make the blessing, and we'll remind ourselves of the ancient practice, and it will be as if, and I think the way that people tend to think of this thing that gets burnt in the oven, not on the altar, but just in our home oven, is like a little offering to God, right? So we are reenacting all this stuff. But once we've created this new ritual, how do we begin to build upon it and really get to the loaves in front of us? Well, that also borrows from ancient practices, but not directly, just symbolically. And one of them is in our Torah reading this week, just this week. Parshat B'Shalach, this week in the book of Exodus, the Jews have just left Egypt, and God begins to, and this is also a major kind of bread narrative here. God rains down bread from the heavens, manna, right? But what does God say there? Here, this is this week's Torah portion. This is current events, so to speak. I will rain down bread for you from the sky, and the people shall go out and gather each day that day's portion, that I may thus test them to see whether they will follow my instructions or not. But on the 6th day, when they apportion what they have brought in, it shall prove to be double the amount they gather each day. Okay? So why do we have 2 loaves of challah? It represents the double portion that arrived on the 6th day, so you could have for Friday and for Saturday. That's not a law that you have to have 2 loaves. It's a memory of a story, right? That's how we get to the 2 loaves. You saw how we got to the taking of the challah to remember that institution. Now there's another memory that's been embedded in our challah, the memory of the manna. And finally, there's yet another institution that gets recorded, which is the showbreads that the priests would put on the table in the sanctuary, right? Here you shall take choice flour and bake of it 12 loaves, 2/10 of a measure for each loaf, okay? And they're arranged here before the Eternal regularly every Sabbath day. And the words that are used here are challah. Now, that's 12 loaves that were stacked in the temple and offered sort of as an offering before God. So that's also embedded in the challah. And do anyone know how we get to the 12 loaves? Where do we get? How do we remind ourselves of those 12 loaves?
The tribes.
No, but that's a symbolic connection. But we reenact the 12 loaves by braiding the challah. One of the reasons that challah is braided is in order to create 6 loaves on each side, so that the challah becomes a representation of the 12 loaves in the temple. Okay? So I know I kind of racing and throwing a lot at you at the end, but you have the critical point, which is that challah was something else, and it was important, but we lost that because it doesn't apply anymore. And the rabbi said, let's create a new institution which is a reminder of the old institution. And then once that new institution gets created, then it's like, well, let's remember the manna also. And let's remember the showbreads also. Let's bring all of our memory of like the spiritual importance of bread and kind of infuse it into our Shabbat practice, so that our table becomes a little altar before God, so that our table becomes a kind of receiving basket for the manna that comes down from heaven, and so that our table becomes a reminder of the sustenance that we get from God. All of that kind of spiritual history is kind of infused into our weekly baking of bread. Right? And it didn't have to be that way. We could have just lost this tradition, but over the course of time, the rabbis made decision after decision that was intended to both preserve the past, but also kind of reinvent it into a new form, a new ritual. And that's how we get to challah, the challah that we eat every Friday. So lots more to be done here in seeing the full evolution of that, but I hope you see at least how it is that we sometimes don't preserve everything from the past for reasons that of burden or irrelevance, but sometimes figure out ways to transform the institutions of the past so we can actually have them alive spiritually, symbolically, still in our consciousness and in the practice of our Judaism. Okay, we'll end there. Thanks, everybody. Nice learning with you all today.